Or, oops, look out. Hello, it's Wednesday. Oh, no, actually it's Friday, and I haven't lost it that bad because this story takes place when I was a kid on a Wednesday. Wednesday was a special day for me because that was the day that this guy took the afternoon off and took his grandson, that would be me, on a special afternoon on Wednesdays. Wednesdays, we had our routine that we would start off by going to one of the many miniature golf courses around Bristol, Tennessee, and Virginia, and we just loved it because we spent the time together, and we had that special time designated. So a Wednesday is in my grandfather's memories are just such a great thing. Part of the day, then we would go to Joe Lippo's State Line Diner that was right off. Remember the stories I told you that Bristol, Virginia, and Tennessee was divided right down this main street, State Line. The Joe Lippo's State Line Diner was on the Virginia side, so we would go there for a steak dinner on Wednesday night, pounded steak. It was a special meal for us on Wednesday afternoon. But then after we finished our dinner, we would go next door to the newsstand. And when I was a kid, he would always say, go to the comic book stand and get one of each, anything that you wanted off the newsstand. And back then it was things like Casper and Popeye and Woody Woodpecker. But by the time I was 10, we started looking at the newsstands and comic book stands a little bit differently, and they started having magazines that look like this. This is the Beatles Complete Life Stories from Dell Comics. Dell Comics were one of the major first publishers of comic books back in the late 1800s, just like my grandfather. He was born in the late 1800s as well, but Dell was one of the big players in that, and they put out a very elaborate comic book. 35 cents for a comic book in 1964 was a lot of change for a comic book, but they had some really beautiful portraits of the Beatles in there, as well as a what would be called today a graphic novel version of the story of the Beatles, each of their life stories, a little bit of background on that, and ended up telling the whole story of the Beatles as it was up until 1964 at that time. Another main player in the comic book industry was the Carlton Company. They made a series of pulp. Both of these manufacturers were primarily in the paperback business, but when they saw the opportunity to hit the kids market, they went into comic books, and this Carlton Company came out with a series of little very light, flimsy paper publications, and this one also told 1964 publications told the story of each of the Beatles, and gave some lyrics to some of the tunes and some more pictures of them. They put out a whole series of these, one for the Hard Day's Night book, one with lots of songs back to back in this book, other topics of help, and just more and more songs. They even went to Dave Clark 5, and in fact the Monkees a little bit later as well. So the Carlton Company was big on the comic book area in that early days. Also, they wanted to target not only the boys but the girls. So the girls had their own comics, of course. My Little Margie with the Beatles on the cover, and the main story in the My Little Margie was Beatlemania. My Little Margie comes from the television show that starred Gail Storm back in the 50s. Teen Confessions with a main story about the Beatles as well. Girls Romance, again, Beatles all over. On Summer Love. Sometimes they would also advertise inside those comic books. They would advertise other goodies that you could buy, like those magazines I just showed you, or photos of your favorite stars. Oh, the Beatles were my downfall. I bet that was the true story of many girls that were reading that. They all even combining both of the movies on the cover of that one, and even as far deep as '68, those are more the White Album style photos went on the cover of Time for Love, still by Charlton Comics. The guys had their superheroes, of course. We've got Jimmy Olsen's Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, as the red-headed Beetle of 1000 BC, and his storyline involves him wearing a beetle wig. Another one where he was bouncier than the Beatles and more electrifying than Elvis as Superman's pal. Strange that Tales brought us the Human Torch and Thing meet the Beatles. Batman got into the act with the Paul is dead rumors when even one of them on the album cover, and the storyline in the Batman comic book paralleling the Paul is dead story. Some comic books were just for fun, like these that say laugh, with the girls thinking about these Beatles and the dad thinking about those Beatles. Again, inside the magazine. Oh, this one has the X-ray specs. I remember ordering those. Very disappointed that those, well, that's a different story. Tippy's Friends, Go and Animal, with real pictures of the Beatles on the cover and other band photos inside. Spoof magazine with John Lennon getting sworn in as president by David Cassidy. Maybe not such a bad idea on that spoof magazine. The Modniks created their own version of a Beatle-type band. Jerry Lewis had his own comic book, and he got into the act with a Beatles story here in this episode with some pretty good likenesses of the Beatles in that story. Some of his other stories were Beatles and the Rockabys, and real actual photos of Jerry and Noel Harrison from The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. Patsy and Heidi got in the act. Some of the magazines included real photos with a little information about the Beatles included with their comic book storylines. And this one had like a full-page pinup of drawing of Peter and Gordon. Millie the Model was cooler than the Beatles, kookier than the Kinks. Tippy Teen, another one with real photos included and worked into the storyline. Millie the Model. Millie goes to Carnaby Street. This girl fell in love at the Woodstock Festival. This one with the rock happening. They make up their own band called the Beagles. If you remember the other story I told, where Wayne got kind of confused, maybe he was referring to this comic book. But lots and lots of Beatle references in the comic book world, and of course, then the mainstays of the comic book world being the Archies. The Archies formed their own band called, conveniently enough, the Archies, and they were America's answer to the Beatles. And all of Archie's comics, a lot of Archie's interwoven the Beatles into their storylines and covers and text like that. And that just gives me a chance to mention and show off a little a couple of Ron Dante autographs there on the Archie or Jangle Jangle album, and some fun with that one. And I'm just glad that the Beatles came along, because if you're one of, like me, that's got that collector's gene, that you've got to start accumulating stuff, I'm glad I was able to focus on the Beatles, because it would have been very, very easy to have gone to build a collection and other things, like also a television nut. I would love all the comic books that have anything to do with television, like Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek, Dark Shadows, even more recent things like Alf. Oh, I loved Alf. Alf was a funny show. And so many other comics in the television areas, Mission Impossible, Land of the Giants, Nanny and the Professor, and all so far, especially the science fiction type things like Time Tunnel Invaders and any of the very, very strange ones like Things to Drive You Bats and just a magazine called Plop. So that kind of intentionally or not, I hope you've got some laughs off of some of these, and just glad that the Beatles bring a little smile to the faces through the comic book stores. Next time, I'm going to tell a story about an encounter with someone that Ringo speaks of on his albums, I believe. So we'll see you on Tuesday. Peace and love and science. Be safe out there.